So we now have two different things we can focus on. The first one is changing the display up here to be green on the winning player. And that one's pretty simple. And the second one is getting the reset button to work so that we can reset and play again. So let's start with the color change. And I'm going to do that by defining a class in a CSS file. So I need to make a CSS file, and I'm just going to call that scorekeeper.css. Then I'm going to link to it instead of my HTML file, scorekeeper.css, and save. Then I'm going to go to my CSS file and define a class, and I'll just call it winner. And I'm just going to say color is green, and that's all we need. And we'll save, and just to check that it looks the way I want it to, let's just add it to the span. So we'll say class equals, and we'll just give it a class of winner for player 1 display from the get-go. And if I refresh, you can see we get a green 0. That's exactly what we want. As I increment, of course, we want it to start as black and only add the class when game is over. So we need to go back to our JavaScript. We can get rid of this. So it goes back to black. Go to our JavaScript now. So we'll just start for player 1. And we need to check if the player 1 score is equal to winning score, that means that player 1 has won. So in here, we're going to add to the player 1 display dot class list, we're going to add the class winner. And that's all we have to do. So if we refresh, you'll see as I increment player 1 score and get to 5, that class has been added. So if we take a look here, I'll inspect it. There is no class. And I keep incrementing until we get to 5. Pay attention right in here. And we get class equals winner added when we get to 5. So we'll do the same thing for player 2. So if player 2 score is the winning score, we'll change the player 2 display. Let's check. Increment this to 5. Great. Everything seems to be working just fine. So the next piece is getting the reset button to work. Right now, if we get game over, it's always set to be true. There's no way to change game over. So clicking the reset button needs to trigger a few different lines of code. The first one, we want to change player 1 score and player 2 score back to 0. We want to change the values here that are displayed in the player 1 display and player 2 display to be 0. And we want to remove this green class from whichever element it's on. And then the last thing is we need to make sure that game over goes back to being false so that our code in here can run again. So the first thing, we need to select the button. We gave it ID equal reset. So we'll need to go over here and just select it. So I'll do it with the other button. So var reset button equals document dot, and we'll do another get element by ID. And this time the ID is reset. And we'll save. And then just to check that it works, we'll do a console.log reset button and refresh. If we look in our console, we get our correct button that's been console.logged. Okay, so we should start by adding our event listener for a click on that reset button. So reset button dot add event listener, click, add our callback function, and all that we'll want to do to start, again, just console.log reset clicked, just to make sure it works. And there we go, our reset button has been clicked. So the logic though, as we discussed, we need to set player 1 score and player 2 score back to 0. So that's straightforward enough. Player 1 score is 0, player 2 score is 0. But if I run this right now, where I only changed player 1 score and player 2 score to be 0, and I increment so that player 1 wins, and I click reset, nothing appears to happen. And that's because we only changed the score in JavaScript. We never updated the scores on the page. So those are the P1 and P2 display variables that we need to update. So we'll want to do P1 display.text content, and we can just set it to 0. We could also set it to be P1 score. They should both be 0. So same thing, P2 display.text content is 0. If we refresh now and we get to 5, they both go back to 0. So let's make it a closer game and click reset. Both go back to 0. Next up, let's remove the winner class. We'll just do it the easy way by removing the winner class from both. So we won't even check which one has it. We'll just remove it from both. So that's just a matter of p1display.classList.remove winner. So that will get rid of the class. And we'll also do it on p2 display. So whichever one has it, it doesn't matter because we're removing it from both. So now if we play a game, we get a winner. I click reset. They both go back to just a black plain text. But as you can see, I get to 5, I click reset, my buttons still don't work. And that's because game over is still true. And so none of our code inside of these events is going to run. So the last thing we need to do is set game over back to false. And that should enable us to keep playing. So I will refresh, increment this, let's get a game over. There we go, I can't play anymore. I click on reset, and now game over is back to false, and I can play again. And then keep going. So that's the core functionality here. We have almost everything done. The very last thing is getting the playing to number, or the winning score, to be a variable, so it's not always just 5. So we have this input, and we want to use this so that when I change this to be 7, this says playing to 7, and our maximum or our winning score is 7 rather than 5. So we have a few steps to get there. The first thing we need to do is select this input. As you can see, we have input type equal to number. It's the only input on the page, so we don't necessarily have to give it an ID or anything. So I'm going to go over here and just select it with my other selectors. Var, let's just call it num input equals document. And there's a lot of ways of getting it. We can do document.querySelector input. We could also specify only where type is equal to number, because there could be other inputs. In our case, I'll keep it simple. There's only one input, so this will work just fine. Okay, so we have that input selected. So now let's add an event. So what we want to happen is that anytime this changes, the value or the number changes, we want this to update, and we want the winning score variable to update as well. So what we need to do is add an event. So we'll just go num input dot add event listener, click. Let's do it this way here. Function, and I'll do an alert. Clicked the input. And what you'll see is that actually a click listener is not the best tool for this job, because yes, we can change the value with a click like I just did there, but I can also hit delete and type a number myself, and no event was fired because I didn't have to click. So if I use the little buttons here, a click event fires. Otherwise, if I just use my keyboard, we don't get a click event. So there's another type of event that's much better in this case, which is called change. So a change event will run anytime the value changes, and it doesn't matter how that value changed, if it was because I clicked or I hit the delete key. So let's actually change the alert here to say changed the input, and then refresh. And if I click here to change it, it tells me you changed the input. But if I delete and I type a number, which doesn't involve clicking, it also tells me that I changed the input. So that's great. This is the event we want to use, the change event. Anytime the value changes, we want to update this number here. And we also want to update our winning score so that our game continues to go until we hit that new winning score. Hopefully this is not our actual winning score, definitely long game of rock, paper, scissors. So the first thing is updating this value here. So just like before, we need to select it, which it's a paragraph. So we need to select our paragraph, and I'll just do a var paragraph equals document.querySelector p tag. And then in this click event, we'll just change p.textContent, and we'll just start by just changing it to say clicked, or let's say value changed. Just like that. And refresh. Now if I change the value, that paragraph changes to say value changed. But this is our same problem we ran into earlier with the H1. We don't want to change the entire paragraph. We only want to change this small portion. So what we want to use is actually another span. So we'll go back and we'll add a span around the number. And this is a perfect use for a span where, again, we can use it to target just a small portion of an element, not the entire thing. And I'm actually not going to give it an ID this time, just to show you another way of selecting it. So just remember, it's a span inside of a paragraph, and it's the only one like that on our page. So we'll go back. So rather than selecting the paragraph, let's create a new variable, and we'll call it winning score display, and it's going to be document.querySelector. But rather than just a span, because there are other spans on the page, we want to select spans inside of paragraphs. So that's all we have to write, p space span. And we'll save. And now let's go ahead and update the winning score display down here instead of paragraph. So winning score display like this, and it's still not going to be perfect. It's only going to update value changed every time, but at least it's not updating the entire paragraph. So the next step is getting it to update to display the number that's inside the input so that the values are synced together. So we haven't actually seen how we get the data from an input. How do we get the current value? I'm going to show you here by selecting the input. So document.querySelector. I'm just going to do it in the console. Input. And I'm going to save it to a variable. So we'll call it var input document.querySelector input. And then we'll do an input dot value. So that dot value is going to be a string of whatever is contained in this input, whatever the value is. So if I change this to 7 and I run the code again, I get 7. If I make it a huge number and this time I do it again, it reflects whatever value is inside of this input. So we're going to make use of that by changing this. Instead of to the string value changed, we're going to change it to be num input dot value. So that will take the value from here and change the winning score display's text content. So we refresh and I update this, and you can see they're now in sync together. So as I update this to be 1, 2, 3, my playing to, or the winning score display, also updates to 1, 2, 3. So of course, we're not playing to 123, we're still playing to 5. And that's because our logic isn't reflecting this new input value. All that it's reflecting is our original winning score of 5. So we also want to change down here our winning score to be equal to num input dot value and save. And now let's try changing this so we're playing to 3. And we click, and you'll notice we get some weird behavior. So it didn't even stop at 5, it just keeps going forever. So this is a fun bug that has to do with different types of data, strings and numbers, and comparing them, double equals versus triple equals. So to get to the bottom of it, let's do some console.logging. So we know that the crux of all of this is this line here, or this line here, where we're checking if the player has won. If the player's score equals the winning score, that's when we set game over to be true. And that's not happening right now because game over, if we change the score, game over is never changing. It's always false. So something's going wrong with this line. So let's do a console.log, and we're going to do two things. Let's just print out the player 1 score, and we'll print out the winning score. And we can separate them by commas, and then we'll just print them on the same line. Just a quick note, using console.logs is how we're going to debug for now, but we will be talking about more advanced ways of debugging later on. So I'll refresh, and if we start, we take a look. I increase player 1 score, and you can see that we get 3, and we're comparing it to the number 5. So player 1 score is 3, winning score is 5. But as soon as I change this to be, let's say 7, and now I click player 1, we're now comparing player 1 score, which is the number 4, to winning score, which is the string 7. So I'll refresh again. If I just start with 5, it works just fine. But if I change this, and now we compare, it's a number and a string. And that's not going to work for us because we're doing triple equals here. So we could do double equals, but you know I'm not a fan of that. So what we're going to do instead is go down here and just take this num input.value and turn it into a string. So number, just like that. Capital N number, and then pass in num input.value, which will then turn it into a string, and set that to be winning score. So we refresh now. This works just fine. We get to 5. But if we also change this to be 2, our game is over at 2. There is one small issue we need to focus on, which is if we're playing a game to 5, which is what we start out doing, and if I decide halfway through that I want to change the winning score, the maximum score, our code right now doesn't handle that very well. Because if I change this, so now we're only playing to 3, we have 2 different ways of handling this. The first one is resetting the score and everything back to 0. And the other one is continuing to play to 5. But what's actually happening is that we're playing to 3, but we've already passed 3. So because we already passed it, our code doesn't really work anymore because our line is just checking, is player 2 score equal to the winning score? It's not checking if it's greater than the winning score. So we could change that so it says if it's greater than the winning score, then game is over. And that's fine. But I think the better solution is to reset to 0 whenever we change the maximum score. Because we had never really changed the maximum score halfway through a game anyways, we would want to start the game over. And the other reason that I want us to do this is it's a good use case for a short refactor. So when we change the score here, or the winning score, we want to reset the game, which is the same logic that we're running in here. So we'll do that very simply. I'm just going to copy this code out and make a new function called reset. So function reset, just put all of this code in there. And then once the number input changes, we're just going to run reset. So you'll see if I reset here, playing to 5, this works fine. We get to 5, I click reset. And we haven't called the reset function inside of this event listener. So we need to add our reset function call. And now if we refresh, we get to 5. I click reset. That's all good. And now if I'm in the middle of a game and I change the score, it also resets us. And now we play to 1 and it works. Or if I change, so we're now playing to 7, it resets us back to 0. So if I decide, you know what, this is actually a game going to 2 instead, it changes us back to 0, and we don't have to worry about how to handle it if we change halfway through. So what we're doing is just resetting, made a separate function to dry up the code rather than duplicating this here and down here. So that's it for now. That's all we need to do. Some of you may be wondering if this code is really the best way that we could possibly do this. And the answer is no. And if you take a close look, you'll see that it's extremely similar. It's basically the same, except we're doing P1 up here and P2 down here, but every other word is the same. So there are more advanced ways of refactoring this, of making this a little bit better, but I'm not going to do that here because all I want to focus on is conceptually how we can take JavaScript, event listeners, selectors, DOM manipulation, and interact with HTML, and that's what I want to focus on. But just know that we will be seeing ways to make code like this look a little bit better, be a little bit shorter. There is one thing that we could do down here, numinput.addEventListener. We could just replace numinput here with the word this. It's a minor change, but we can do that, and it just shortens up the code a little bit. So if I change this, we're now playing to 3. Everything still works exactly the same. I just use the keyword this, which refers to whatever the event was listening on, which was our number input. All right, so that's it for this lesson. As I mentioned, in the next project, we're going to build something more substantial, and I promise it will look a lot better than this did here.